Afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining this Common Action Forum's webinar. We have celebrated during the last years the annual Octagon and dedicated it to the issue of Palestine-Israel crisis. And now, 1 week ago, we have seen the Hamas attack to Israel, which became a historical date, the worst attack that Israel had suffered in only 1 day. And after that, and right now we are witnessing the way Gaza is completely surrounded, and we are very close to a humanitarian tragedy. Wada, I would like to start with you, and I would like to ask if is really the Western media giving the full picture of these conflicts?
Thank you, Rafael. I think the Western media is under the influence of one-sided narrative, which is the Israeli narrative. And this is not something new regarding the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Simply, we have witnessed that the Western centers of power in general have given Israel impunity during the last few decades, actually. And therefore, media, which in my opinion, to a large extent, is following the centers of power in the Western world, has also adopted the same perspective. For example, at this stage, when the event started on the 7th of October, as you said, the media is using the complexity of the situation to devoid the narrative from its context, from its history, from the past of it, from simple facts, like the fact that Gaza is under occupation. Gaza has been under blockade for at least 16, 17 years. The fact that the Oslo Agreement, which was signed 30 years ago, was not implemented. The Israelis have never really done what they have promised. We're supposed to be celebrating this year the 25th anniversary of the Palestinian state. That has not happened. The deadlock of the peace process, actually the utility of the peace process in order to continue the occupation and the suppression of the Palestinian issue, the evolution of occupation into full-fledged apartheid state in Palestine, the right-wing government that has invaded al-Masjid al-Aqsa, converted the status of the mosque, which has been well established during the last few decades, and also at the same time, the settlements that have been invading the West Bank and the settlers who have become very aggressive in attacking the Palestinians. All that narrative was not given. So the issue is as if we have peace and tranquility, and suddenly some crazy people decided to shatter that peace by killing and slaughtering kids. And therefore, you know, this is how it is. In fact, the media is guilty also of not only leaving the context of the conflict out from the narrative, but also repeating falsified information about what happened and repeating statements that without trying to confirm it from any other independent sources. Of course, we know there is a toolbox of statements that people normally use in this kind of case, and we have seen this, including repeating statements about, for example, the white phosphorus, where Gaza has been bombarded with, and the White House would say, no, we did not have that authenticated from an independent source. Although we know previous wars, you know, independent sources did confirm that. And we know that today Amnesty International did declare that it was used. Beside the fact of ignoring Gaza, I was really amused by a response of an American presidential candidate to a journalist. The journalist said, we see the killing of civilians in Gaza. We have witnessed on Al Jazeera the killing of so many children and so on. You know what his answer was? Don't watch Al Jazeera. Simple. So if you don't watch what is happening in Gaza, Gaza does not exist. The fact that we have at least 400 child being murdered during the last week, it doesn't matter if you don't watch it. You know, the fact that hospitals have been attacked, The fact that 30 ambulances have been destroyed during the last few days. The fact that the demand of Palestinians to evacuate from the half of Gaza, basically 1 million, the conspiracy to take them out of Gaza into Sinai, all of that, you know, it could fit within one narrative. Israel is defending itself. So this beautiful term, Israel has the right to defend itself, could cover up on every atrocity. In fact, the president of Israel today, Herzog, or yesterday, he said something also very interesting, which in my opinion, in every legal framework, he should be held accountable for it. He said that the people, the ordinary people of Gaza are responsible because since they did not revolt against Hamas, they deserve to be treated as they are treated. So basically, he is justifying a genocide for the public civilians in Gaza. And this is unbelievable. You know, in the lexicon of war, this amounts to a full-fledged, you know, justification of genocide. And this, in my opinion, the world should notice it. But as I said, media until now is trying hard to maintain the Israeli narrative. Although the last 2 days, I can witness some cracks in the narrative because I see the response in the streets of London, many other capitals in the world, and of course, the immense popular demonstrations in the Arab world have sent a message that actually the masses are not duped by this kind of propaganda, and therefore more balance is needed in order to cover the system. Thank you.
Perhaps now, Arlene, please. Thank you, Wada. Arlene, following what Wada just said about the coverage of these events, you as historian, could you help us to understand the main historical elements that led to this conflict between Palestine and Israel? Arlene, just 1 second, you are unmuted. Yes.
Okay, so well, first of all, thank you, Rafa, and to CAF for hosting this event and for the opportunity to talking to all of you. Well, yes, well, there's the immediate context, which I will come back to in briefly, because I think it's really important not to forget the framework this is happening in, and which has been forgotten very much, as Wada has said. We're talking about a decades-long struggle for liberation. So this is happening inside the framework of a struggle for liberation and a century-long struggle for national emancipation that has been impeded, well, initially by the alliance between British imperialism and Zionist settler colonialism, following then during the Cold War, growing US and even unconditional US support to state the point in which we are now. So this is the large framework that should never be forgotten if we want to understand what's happening. And then there's the more recent context, which has already been treated here. But, you know, just to remember, we're talking about the failure of Oslo, of the Oslo peace process to deliver a state, the maintenance of occupation with everything that this means, with the growing number of settlers inside the West Bank, and then finally the closure, the complete closure of the Gaza Strip, turning it into not only an open-air prison, as it's been called, but actually a ghetto. We're talking about a 21st century, huge 2.3 million people ghetto. And this following, you know, a process that was of legitimate legislative council elections that was boycotted by the international community, by the powerful countries, European countries, Israel. They did not accept the outcome of this election, therefore leading to a boycott that ended up with a split in, just to, you know, wrap up the subject, a split inside the Palestinian government, and finally a policy of systematically led by Netanyahu to actually keep this split, never allow the government to reunite and to go back into a democratic process of legitimate representations, elections, and so on, as a means of not having someone to negotiate with, not having a partner for peace, and justifying the maintenance of this situation of the status quo. So the status quo that would allow Israeli expansionism to go on, and then the more immediate elements, you know, of what we're talking about. The immediate elements are very much linked to what happened this year. So the normalization process is reaching Saudi Arabia, which is crucial, you know, and which would be quite a big step after normalization with United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Sudan, and Morocco, and so forth. So this is an important aspect, probably, of the, you know, of the tension that might have led to this attack. Then, very important is all the, since January, but even before, but more since January, all the invasions, the violations of the Haram al-Sharif, the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, with the clear and declared attempt to alter the status quo and to suddenly put this space, this area, the third most sacred area in Islam, as disputed terrain, which has always, you know, been very well consolidated as an Islamic site, and with the Waqf in the hands of Jordania. And so suddenly there's this attempt that really has led to, you know, discontent all over, not only Palestine, but well beyond Palestinian contexts. The settler violence, pogroms, Hawara, all this incited by the government, about this right-wing supremacist government, and the speaking of violence, the words that are used, the frankly racist context that the whole situation has been brought into this year. So this is these are the immediate elements, with more than one Palestinian killed every day in the West Bank, just to speak of that situation. So there's a drastic worsening of the situation this year, but always I would like to stress that we should never forget the context in which we're speaking about. And if we're going to speak about you know, techniques of uprising, well, only a few years ago, 2018 and 2019, there was a nonviolent resistance movement, a huge, massive nonviolent resistance movement in Gaza, which was the Great March for Return, and it was received with live ammunition by the Israeli army on the fence, on the patrols, and with several hundred Palestinians being killed by live ammunition. So there's this clear dehumanization of the Palestinian, in which the world does not see his condition and does not see his struggle for liberation as a legitimate, although it is perfectly well consolidated as a historic and legitimate struggle.
Thank you, Arlene. Arlene, you mentioned some actually ideas of a peace agreement, and Daniel, you were working during the last decades on this issue, and we are always listening to that, the need of a peace agreement. But realistically, with all your experience, was a peace agreement ever close to happen? Could you give us a glimpse on that?
Yeah, I mean, Raphael, first of all, thanks. And Oslo came at a particular moment in terms of the local Israeli-Palestinian context and the geopolitical context, this kind of unipolar American moment. And look, you'd had the first Intifada, the popular uprising, you'd had a PLO that also in the context of that unipolar moment had seemed to transition to a position of partition based on a Palestinian state in just 22% of the land. And you had an Israel that was beginning to feel that the occupation was not going to be costly in the context of the first Intifada. And so the premise was that there would be this deal, Israel would withdraw, even if this wasn't explicit in the agreements, there would be a Palestinian state on 22% of the land, with some positives in terms of dismantling occupation, and certainly from within the Palestinian community and for some in Israel, lots of negatives. This was obviously not going to be premised on justice, and the refugee community saw this as very problematic. Part of the premise was the US was in a position to deliver this deal, and the US failed to deliver its ally Israel. I was in the negotiation which probably came closest in Taba, and we still weren't there. The idea that the Palestinians, having accepted, just to deal with 67 really, were going to still be watered down in that position was, I think, in historic terms, a great mistake by Israel. Today, 30 years later, to consider this to still be a peace process is an act in obfuscation and make-believe. But the failure on delivering on that has really important implications for today, because when you look at Hamas's position, as opposed to that of Fatah, the party that signed the agreement, the PLO, which Fatah dominates, the Palestinian Authority, which Fatah dominates, because their approach of negotiation, desisting from armed resistance, relying on the West to deliver Israel, because that approach has been so thoroughly discredited and torn to pieces, more settlements, more entrenched occupation, what the human rights organizations credibly call a regime of apartheid, you see that they are in no position to lead the Palestinians. And you can understand the embeddedness of Hamas in that respect. Of course, you went through the second intifada as well, which was, I think, very shocking for Israelis. And so you see this mutual dehumanization, and the events of the last week, whether what happened to the devastating, we have to acknowledge that, the crime that was committed against Israeli civilians, and the devastation, the crime that is being committed against Palestinians in Gaza, none of that would have been possible without this ongoing process of dehumanization. But you can't get it right unless you ask the question that you just asked, Raphael, which isn't just two stories of dehumanization. There's a story of context. And so you need that context. And now what you're hearing on the Israeli side is taking that dehumanization. The language we're hearing is taking it to a whole new level. This is a genocidist language, and it's terrifying. And the other thing that I'd say to close is that we've seen in the last years not only the dismissiveness towards the root causes of Palestinian dispossession and permanent subjugation, but we've seen approaches that are so dismissive as to have encouraged the terrible place we are today. So you saw the permanent closure of Gaza. A child who was born on the day the closure began is now about to finish high school. Can you imagine living that life without a horizon beyond Gaza? You saw an idea that Palestinians could be bought off by economic confidence building measures without politics. And you saw the most ridiculous idea, which is that Middle East peace would be secured by creating normalization between parties who are not at war with each other anyway. Israel and Gulf states, and recognizing Moroccan sovereignty on Western Sahara under Trump, and Biden continued this. And I highlight that because when political actors tell themselves lies for long enough, they believe their lies and they lose contact with reality.
Thank you, Daniel. All of you, Arlene and Daniel, you mentioned the Oslo Agreement, and it was 30 years ago. Omar, after that, as hegemonic power, what was the U.S. policy for the stability of Israel and Palestine during the last years after all this failure of Oslo Agreement?
Thank you. First of all, I would say that the kind of focus on stability from the United States is a consequence of the U.S. approach always being looking through the Israeli prism and what Israel needs, as opposed to what would be good for resolving conflict, or what the Palestinians need. If you look at those administrations that you're talking about, and if it would be helpful to take a look at the various approaches from the different administrations. You can kind of see how they approach that issue. Taking Obama to start, I think Obama approached this issue out of earnestness of trying to resolve it, but he failed, I think, in two particular ways. In one sense, he got unlucky because obviously he inherited crises in terms of a global economic crisis and two wars that were very distracting in that regard. And also he inherited Netanyahu to an extent. Netanyahu came to power a couple months after Obama. And so he was dealing with Netanyahu's obfuscation. But the failure in that is the kind of naivete to treat Israel and to treat Netanyahu as a good faith actor, that it actually is striving for peace with the Palestinians along the lines that the Palestinians want. or that the Palestinians or that the U.S. really wants. And that's so it's always treating the Israelis with carrots instead of sticks at the right opportunity. It's always, and this is, again, part of the problem with the U.S. political system, and it's always deferential to the concerns of the Israelis, and therefore can never take an even-handed approach to this issue, because U.S. politicians are constrained, because if they take any kind of even-handed approach, then they pay the cost in terms of domestic U.S. politics. And so that was a problem with Obama and a problem with everybody that's come before and after. If you look at Trump, he's obviously quite a different approach than Obama took. In a sense, I mean, Trump was a bit of an empty vessel, so he deferred to his lieutenants and those two, the people he put in positions of power on this issue, and that's obviously his son-in-law Jared Kushner and his bankruptcy lawyer David Friedman, and both of those people came to office already with a fervent support for the Israeli far right and the settler movement, and so their approach was to give the Israelis every single thing they wanted, put tremendous pressure on the Palestinians, and to sideline the Palestinians through this regional normalization project that they helped facilitate. And so they didn't really play a destabilizing role. In fact, it was always about kind of breaking the mold of whoever came before. But nonetheless, it was still within the kind of same paradigm of looking at this issue through Israeli eyes and really taking Israeli considerations into account without the Palestinians. Biden, I think, came to power, and I think in some senses he surprised a lot of people. I don't think many people recognized or took seriously his avowed Zionism as a politician, his track record that goes back years on this issue. But he both stated he was going to roll back Trump's policies, but also take a very light approach to this. I mean, you have to kind of put him in regard or situate him as Obama's vice president and learning the lessons of Obama's failures in the sense of the political costs that were attached to that approach. With Obama, again, the issue, the failure actually with Obama, one thing I forgot to say is that the naivete is that when you don't take take somebody like Netanyahu seriously, and you treat him like he wants peace, then you're never willing to go far enough and put your cards on the table. And so you're bound to fail unless you're really willing to act in a strong way. And that was kind of the failure of Obama. Biden, his general approach, again, learning from that, is not to roll back the Trump. His Zionism has not allowed him to take any kind of stance in rolling back what Trump implemented, but he's not intervened at all. I mean, he's been a shock in that regard. In terms of you have the most right-wing, the most fanatical government in Israel's history, and he's been completely unwilling to take any kind of steps to curb that, to restrain that, to use American leverage to put pressure on the Israelis, and we're seeing the consequences of that. He didn't meet with Netanyahu, but I mean that's trivial in regard to this issue. So again, the focus on stability from the U.S. I think is everything through this Israeli prism, and it presumes that the status quo itself is good for everybody. But really, the status quo and stability is good for the person or the party that's in power, and it's not good for the Palestinians or resolving the issue as a whole. And it's obviously good for the international supporters of Israel because they want policies that are not controversial. They don't want to take stands in their own public political domains that force them to take on the Israelis.
Omar, I would like to take from this point, Omar, thank you very much. I'd like to take from this point and move to Wada into a more regional.
Can I say one quick thing?
Yes, of course.
Sorry, again, stability in that regard, but the Palestinians are agents of change. The Palestinians require change. Only through change can they achieve any type of liberation. And so this kind of dichotomy between stability and change is huge. And there's a fallacy that the status quo is also fully stable because it ignores the colonization that Israel is putting into effect. It ignores the brutality of the occupation. It ignores the crystallizing of apartheid. And the attack that we witnessed is a consequence of that frustration that is focused solely on stability, the slow deterioration of the Palestinian circumstances, and not addressing these underlying issues.
Thank you. Yes, so you don't have the stabilization from the hegemonic power. Then what happens exactly to the regional powers? Let us say, how strong is really the involvement of Iran in this particular event? And is there also anything particular from any other Arab country or Turkey in this context?
So the facts, as I see it, as following. This particular attack that happened on the morning of 7th of October was orchestrated, was done, executed, planned entirely by the military wing of Hamas. And I don't think anyone outside a small group did know about this attack, including the political leadership of Hamas overseas, that means in diaspora, including the Iranians or their allies in the region like Hezbollah and others. So this is number one. Second, it is not a secret that Hamas is supported by Iran and in alliance with Hezbollah in the region and many other groups who are operating against the Israelis. The Iranians are the only power in the region that has support to Hamas in many ways, including the financial support and so on. And politically, I see them right now, the main power in the region, moving around. Yesterday, the Minister of Foreign Affairs met with Hamas leadership in Doha, and today he did deliver a strong message to the international community, including a direct threat that neither Iran nor anyone of its allies in the region are going to keep silent if this issue continues. So if there will be some major operation done in Gaza, I expect that Hezbollah in southern Lebanon could start escalating more than now. Now we see escalation up to this moment. Today we have some 5 missiles at least fired from southern Lebanon into northern Israel. But in my opinion, Hezbollah understands that if Israel succeeds in breaking the resistance in Gaza, they will be the next in the list of targeting by the Israelis. Therefore, they are not at all going to just wait and see what's going to happen to them. Besides, if the axis, which Iran calls the axis of resistance of the region, that includes, of course, Iran, Hezbollah, Al-Hashd al-Sha'bi in Iraq, the Al-Houthis in Yemen, and the Jihad Islami in Palestine, and so on. If they do not do anything about Gaza, then they cannot talk in the future about axis of resistance. Not only that, but also what they have built during the last 2-3 decades of major influence in Syria and in Lebanon and in Iraq might crumble, because in this case, new forces might start to reshape the reality in the Middle East. So my expectation, if Israel goes ahead with the military invasion and there is a major devastation happens in Gaza, which is expected, of course, then in this case, Hezbollah will be under heavier pressure to participate in this war. And in this case, the war becomes regional confrontation. And when it becomes regional confrontation, it will invite everyone in. It means definitely the Russians are excited and happy to see the situation deteriorating in the region, because it will ease the pressure in Ukraine on them from the Ukrainian front. The Chinese today, the position of the Chinese Minister of Foreign Affairs was powerful as well. And in my opinion, the Chinese also are happy to see the Americans dragged into a major confrontation in the region, because it will ease the pressure on them in the Pacific. So if this goes beyond Gaza, and if the Israelis insist on continuing their attack, which they are doing at this moment in time, preparing for it at least, I expect a regional confrontation. Now, there is a last element which is very important to notice. Most of the analysts in the West, including the political elite, ignore the people in the region. I mean, they concentrate on having meetings with this president, that minister, this prince, that king, and so on and so forth. And they think that this position of the Arab leaders reflect the position of Arabs in the region. In my opinion, the Arab world at this moment in time is desperate in many ways. Economically, there is a major crisis in almost every Arab country at this stage, if you exclude the Gulf states. When it comes to the political, reality, it is demoralizing and to a large extent dead end when it comes to the possibility of change and democracy. So there is massive problem happening. The issue of Palestine could become a catalyst whereby a second wave of Arab Spring, a second wave of major spillover that could be converted into destabilization, into revolutions, into demand for change could start in this region. So I don't expect that this conflict, if it continues, and if the Israelis continue what they are doing right now, is going to be limited to Gaza. I understand that Blinken and everyone else is putting pressure on their allies in the region to pressurize the other parties not to be involved. But in my opinion, it is not going to happen like that, because everyone is scared if they're not involved, they're losing a lot in this case. So yes, it is going to be very complicated.
Wada, you were just alerting to an issue that will affect this area of historically Semitic people. Arlene, is it correct to say that the notion of anti-Semitism was or has been hijacked by the Zionism during the last years?
Yeah, well, Rafa, well, first of all, what is understood by anti-Semitism? When did the term, when was it born? Well, hatred and persecution, violence and against the Jews has existed throughout history and for different reasons in different times and places, but basically in Europe, since the Roman Empire. The term anti-Semitism, it was born around the 1870s and very much in opposition to an intellectual of the time, Ernest Renan, who brought into the framework of intellectual ideological thought in the 19th century, the idea of racialization of politics. And he was very much in opposition to Semites. And for Renan, Ernest Renan, Semites meant both Jews and Arabs. But then it did not work that way. And the term became initially, up to today, has always meant the persecution against a Jew for the sole reason of being a Jew. So an inside imperialist, colonialist, European framework. So that's how the term came to be used and how it is known. So it is really a term that means today. And something very interesting is that during the Holocaust and in camps, extermination camps such as Auschwitz, the term Musliman, or the Muslim, as it was denominated there, was also used against those who were inside the camps and who were dying and who were very sick and were like the last scale of dehumanization inside the extermination camps. So, in many ways, the Nazis also understood the Semite in a more general context, but it has been used as the sentiment of racial discrimination against the Jew, right? Now, in 1947, when the United Nations General Assembly voted for the partition of Palestine, it was very much under the impact of the Holocaust and the idea of compensating the Jews through their representative, which was one of the representatives at that moment, the Zionist movement, by means of partitioning Palestine and delivering the land to build a country as a compensation. So the Zionist movement understood very early on that it was favorable for the building of Israel to instrumentalize all this idea and fact and reality of anti-Semitism for their means, as an instrument of justifying their colonialist policies inside the Middle East. And this, however, grew after the 1970s. The 1970s, early 1970s, was an unfavorable moment for Israel. I mean, after the 1973 war, its destabilizing effect on Zionism, the so-called October or Yom Kippur War, its destabilizing effect on Zionism, the defeat that it did represent, and there was a change in public opinion. And at that moment, it was apparently very important for the Jewish state, the Zionist state, to defend itself, instrumentalizing and building more on the instrumentalization of anti-Semitism. And that was when the idea of a new anti-Semitism was born. Now, it only became a real tendency. It only became what, like Anthony Lerman defines as a new orthodoxy in the 21st century. So in 2016, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance published a working definition on anti-Semitism, which is very weak in terms of defining the hatred itself against the Jews, but very instrumental in defining that any attack on the Zionist state is a form of anti-Semitism, specifically a new anti-Semitism. This was not new, therefore. It was also a slightly revised version of the 2005 working definition that was published by the European Monitoring Center on Racism and Xenophobia, the EUMC. So it was something that had been building and was coming from the 1970s, but inside the framework of the 21st century was really really grew and became more than just an instrument. It became a means of silencing opposition. Now, this narrative, the new anti-Semitism narrative, different from the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century idea of anti-Semitism, this new anti-Semitism, as any criticism of Israel, it was developed together with the idea of the collective Jew among nations, like Israel is as the collective Jew among nations, whose right to exist would be apparently as threatened as the individual Jew's right to exist in Nazi Germany. And this created a very powerful sentiment of identification between the individual Jew and the state that acted in its name, even when it didn't ask for it to act in its name. And in the end, the very twisted and ingenuity of this definition of the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of this new anti-Semitism, is that in the end, this narrative serves to defend the Zionist state, the state of Israel, from criticism, when in fact it was the Zionist state that was built on the justification of defending the individual Jew from anti-Semitism. So it is a very powerful narrative that has been implemented and promoted country throughout the world, trying to stifle free speech, criminalize criticism of politics, criticism of what has to be discussed anyway. We're inside academia, inside the media, and so forth.
Would you allow me to take from this point and just go to Daniel, exactly to understand? Then, Israel then ended up with Netanyahu's government, which is a far right-wing government. And Daniel, how do you evaluate the support of Israeli and Jewish citizens to Benjamin Netanyahu before and after October 7th?
I'll try and be quick because in the interest of time. Look, Netanyahu has over the years become more and more of a polarizing, divisive figure inside Israel and in the Jewish world. And it seems like a different century, but people will remember that just 2 weeks ago today, Israel was still in the midst of every Saturday night. There was a massive protest against the legislative program of Benjamin Netanyahu's current coalition. Now, that was on the one hand an incredibly impressive protest movement. On the other hand, it was a very, very curious protest movement because the slogan of the protesters was democracy. And yet the biggest offense to the idea of democracy was conspicuously absent from the agenda of the protesters, other than a relatively small cohort of anti-occupation, anti-apartheid groups within the protest movement, because here you were demonstrating for democracy, but not mentioning the occupation and the denial of democratic freedoms to the Palestinians who Israel occupies, and of course the structural discrimination against the Palestinian citizens of Israel. But nevertheless, that spoke to just how divisive a figure Netanyahu was, and the opinion polls were not looking at all good for Netanyahu in that respect. And I think on the one hand, there was a tremendous power being gained by the far right of the Israeli political spectrum, and people will by now have been familiar with the names Ben Gvir and Smotrich, and people are still members of the Israeli government, but a sense amongst other citizens of overreach. Now, watershed. Israeli Jews almost, and I had calls today which back this up, are almost entirely unified in support of, despite the horrendous nature of the measures being taken by the government, they are almost totally unified in support of what is being done. And indeed, I was shocked to hear of the extent to which internal dissent or just the expression of a different opinion has become so fragile, so rare. There have been preemptive arrests. There have been arrests for posts on TikTok and Facebook, especially of Palestinian citizens of Israel. But even a head teacher of a school in Tel Aviv who posted literally a one-line phrase, "You know, there are also women, children, and the elderly in Gaza." That was it. This person has been hounded out of their home, will never teach again, will not be able to keep their job. That's the extent of what's going on in Israel today. And I very much expect things to go inside Israel and into the West Bank. We now have a war cabinet. Now, I think another reason to be worried, and I feel like I'm getting apocalyptic, but that's what the scenes look like and what the actions look like, so I don't think it's entirely out of place, is that the extent to which 7th October was such a monumental failure of the Israeli concept of the approach to the Palestinians, and more immediately of Israeli deterrence, Israeli intelligence, and of the Israeli military in their initial response. That means that the morning after the current military campaign ends will be a morning of reckoning for Netanyahu. Okay? Right now, that is not happening in the heat of war. But as soon as the dust settles, the commissions of inquiry will begin and everything will go back to that moment. And you will have the reservists, many of whom took place in the protest movement and are anti-Netanyahu, returning home. And I imagine that one of the things that's keeping them going at the moment is because they want to stand outside of his door and protest against him. Again, with all the shortcomings of the protest movement from the get-go. What that means is that Netanyahu is in absolutely no hurry to get to the morning after. I think this is a very significant, not the only one, and it's not decisive perhaps, but it's a significant encouraging factor for Israel to do its worst. But having said all that about Netanyahu, let me close by saying that we shouldn't pretend that the only problem here is Netanyahu. And I think people who say the failure was because Netanyahu was focused on the judiciary and just on the West Bank, or the disaster of Israeli politics is just Netanyahu, fails to acknowledge that Israel has been on this journey for a long time, and the government that preceded Netanyahu when he was in the opposition, which was led by Bennett, Lapid, and Gantz, who's now in the war cabinet and who is a dangerous individual, that government was dreadful. It began the more intense insertions into Area A. It criminalized Palestinian human rights NGOs, and it really did not address the Palestinian question whatsoever. And this is the long-term drift. The long-term drift from what you asked me to describe about Oslo, when there were two Israeli camps, a more pragmatic camp, they weren't about justice and rights for the Palestinians, but they were about some kind of coming to terms with the existence of Palestinians and the need for a political solution. It was them against the occupation in trenches. Today, the fault line in Israel is between those who say carry on with the occupation and those who say second Nakba, the second mass displacement of Palestinians.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And Omar, after that, is there any, after what Daniel just said, is there now any relevant role left to Fatah and to PLO or any other political actor after Hamas suspended all Netanyahu's plans and the normalization of Israel's relations with Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries? You're muted. Thank you, Omar.
My apologies. I thought I unmuted. Yeah, I think there's two questions there. One on the kind of role of Fatah, but then also in regards to normalization. Fatah, the Fatah-led PA and PLO, was already increasingly marginal within the Palestinian national movement as an organization that's pursuing Palestinian liberation, except as in their role as serving as an instrument of permanent Israeli rule, in which they had been kind of folded into this apparatus. The PLO has over many years become, hollow. It has become, its only role really has been as a rubber stamp to the persistence of the PA as an organization, as a rubber stamp to the project for a Palestinian state, which has obviously failed and become divorced from reality, and there is no process in place anymore to put that into effect. And so the PLO's role has already diminished significantly. The PA again has been folded into kind of Israel's security umbrella, and its leaders have apparently felt it okay to kind of play that role, and to jettison everything else, and they have not become part of it. So when it comes to the issue of normalization, the PLO, I think the PLO leadership had been caught off guard by the kind of 2020 normalization, and its immediate position was a total rejection of that process. Once they realized that rejection didn't have any legs, that it was ineffective, and that's a result of both a failure, I think, to read the geopolitical landscape, how the changes in the region, but a failure to recognize how their own leverage had eroded, and their ability to use the Palestinian cause to prevent these kind of things from happening had failed, and to recognize that what was happening was in a sense of fait accompli. This leadership kind of changed their stance on the issue of normalization. They sort of reconciled with the Emiratis, because they had viewed their position as a failure. And so when it came to the Saudi normalization position, they had taken more of a role in it, at least. Were unwilling to kind of to say to the Saudis that this is not acceptable, and to kind of try to get something for themselves and potentially for the Palestinians as a whole. I think Hamas was looking at that quite differently. It was also, I think, unwilling to challenge directly the Saudi position, but they use the attack itself, which is hard to condemn in the Arab world, as a different way of sabotaging that process. But the longer term effect of that, I think, is unknown at this point. We don't know what the fate of Hamas is. We don't know what the fate. I mean, for the moment, certainly the normalization discussion between Saudi and the Israelis is off the table, is on ice. We don't know the long term effect of that, though, and we don't know of what this attack and the response from the Israelis has precipitated in the long term. I mean, there's so many variables here.
Thank you, Omar. Arlene, you are in Brazil right now, I assume, and Brazil has a very interesting relation to Israel and also to Palestine. What role do you think Brazil could play in this new geopolitical and humanitarian crisis? Thinking of course, Lula's government, Celso Amorim, and all those political actors that are now leading the country.
Right, Rafa. Well, yes, I am speaking from Brazil, and yes, well, I'll try to go straight to the point, jumping over what has been Brazil's traditional position and so on in face of this conflict. But probably going straight to the point, today, Lula's best chance, in spite of the fact that Brazil presides the UN Security Security Council in rotation, but that's a very, very difficult arena there. Lula's best chance is probably to focus on what he has always defended as being his foreign policy focus, which is multilateralism. And one of the most relevant recent events that happened is that Brazil has just been accepted back to the United Nations Human Rights Council for a new three-year mandate after the previous president had removed Brazil. from the Council. And so back to the UNHRC in 2024, next year, Brazil can use this position as a member to support the Commission of Inquiry on Occupied Palestine, and together with other countries investigate apartheid, not only Israeli, but in general, and not to mention all the other restrictions that come and from the situation of apartheid. There's this new international consensus around Israeli apartheid, around the need to pressure Israel to end apartheid, independently of whatever political solution comes in place, of whatever negotiations might take the situation to. And Brazil has built a relation, with other southern countries and with important powers such as China, Russia, with South Africa, all this in the context of decades existence of BRICS and of meetings. So Brazil can keep its independency from all those powers whose position in this conflict has been delegitimized, and together with other countries possibly fill a void which now exists. And with the United States, in getting involved in this conflict so directly, it certainly will not be in a legitimate position to help bring a solution about. Another thing that has to be very rapidly said is that Brazil does not classify Hamas as a terrorist organization, because it's not the custom of Brazil to do that. Brazil follows the United Nations, the classification, and so forth. So although Brazil does not have relations with Hamas either, it is also in a position to keep this independence and to act together with other countries and fill a void in a multilateral context to help bring about pressures and condemnation of apartheid and bringing change in the way of guaranteeing human rights in the region. That would be one thing possible, certainly. And Brazil has, through Lula, a voice, a soft power that is it is relevant. It's not completely void of consequence.
Thank you, Arlene. You just mentioned the Security Council, and their meeting just was finished like a few hours ago. I don't know, Daniel, do you still see any potential thing that the UN could do? Do you expect, I don't know, also something like the emergency of a third intifada, or the collective punishment of Gaza's population that we are following up on the news?
Yes, I think this will go immediately to the General Assembly, actually, having gotten stuck at the Security Council. The current UN Secretary General is a curiously, he's just not taken that role in political crises, which I think is a sad reflection, perhaps also on the Europe that he comes from. But I think the enormity of what we face means that some of the vacuum created by American failure is going to have to be filled, if for no other reason than to pressure the Americans to get out of this really quite pathetic stupor of siding with what's going on at the moment. Because I think, look, people will remember in 2021, when there was the last escalation, there was what Palestinians have called a unity intifada, and the West Bank and inside 48 Israel was involved. And I think it's right now we're all looking at Gaza, as well we should, because the horrendous impact there on the civilian population, the attempt at a mass forced displacement, the death toll now to children in Gaza. So that's where we're focused. But I want to step back for a sec, because in Israeli planning minds, Gaza is actually quite a narrow military security thing, I think. The approach to Gaza has already been scorched earth, and the population of Gaza is already considered by Israelis to be kind of outside the scope of what one has to deal with in the future of the Palestinian affairs, if I can call it that. The real prize for the long-term project of ensuring permanent domination over Palestinians is the West Bank and inside Israel. And that's where we're going. I don't want to say this is the only outcome, because it can go anywhere in such a rapidly changing situation. But I think we are going to see an effort to take a major initiative, and it may start randomly with settlers. And we've already seen killings of Palestinians by the military and settler militias in the last days. But for the long-term project, the West Bank and the Palestinian citizens of Israel have to be brought into this. And what we're seeing is, as this plays out, what Wada said, which is a far more likely broader regional expansion. And let me close by saying this. The way Israel has approached not only the actions, but the framing, the absolute unwillingness to acknowledge a difference between combatants and civilians, the false paradigm that's been set up, which is either Israel has to do something dreadful, and what's underlying that, and what is talked about openly by some, is a second Nakba, a second mass displacement, or there will be a second Holocaust. That's the framing that's being offered in many respects. This is leading to the kind of hell that we saw in Rwanda and the Western Balkans in the 1990s. And that's why the international reaction is led by the Western Europe is so irresponsible, because what we have seen is empathy with Israelis, wrapping one's arms around Israeli humanity, which is absolutely fine. But what is missing is empathy and an acknowledgement of Palestinian humanity. And in the absence of the West's ability to do that in the framing and to adhere to international law and international humanitarian law, we need others to step in. And that's why what Arlene said about Brazil is so important. That's why we need those mid-level global South powers, alongside others in BRICS, of Brazil and Indonesia, African states. I don't think this is to impact Israel, but to impact the US and the West as well, so that they see what is at stake here. And thanks for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And you were saying about the support that Israel is actually having, mainly in the countries of the Atlantic North. I would like to ask Omar, is there also on the other side a risk to see the marginalization of Muslim communities in those countries and the increasing Islamophobia that has happened during the last year, and the power, the symbolic power of the Palestinian cause that is gaining now more and more power? How do you see this combination?
Thank you. It's an interesting question. I mean, first I want to kind of endorse what Daniel said. You know, I fully agree with his last comments here, and I think the Western states are playing a very dangerous game here in how they back the Israelis at a time when not only has it looked genocidal in intent, but Israel, unlike Hamas, has the capabilities to implement policies that that can lead to that type of result, that type of horrific result, and that's been very scary. When it comes to the issue of Islamophobia in Western states, I mean, one thing that I've seen as a result of what's occurred is very much a discrediting of the West in the eyes of many as a result of its reaction and its policies from what's happened over the past week. And you're seeing that on the ground within those states, and you're seeing that in the wider world, certainly. Because, when it came to the Palestinian issue, I think the West had, for a long time, the Western-led order had already been discredited. I mean, this goes back decades. The Palestinian issue is at the founding of the post-World War II international order and the international system. And it's always proved itself, because it became a special case in which the West kind of, moved away from the values and the international law underpinning this system, and made Palestine an exception to this. It always damaged international law, damaged the credibility of the UN, and all of these kind of things. Now we're hitting this point, this new point of increasing multipolarity, the days of a total US European hegemony over the international system seem to be over. And so, in a sense, what Daniel's saying, in terms of the approach of the global South on this issue, emerging powers like Arlene brought up, with Brazil, who may take on the Palestinian issue and be more effective within the international system or push more in that regard is something where you could see kind of a divide. And I think Daniel was right in terms of maybe it's not going to hold Israel to account or influence its own opinion. But when the West, when the United States is looking at this, international politics through the prism of great power politics, it may take more account of the positions of other countries in the global South who it needs on its side or is seeking to court, for whatever initiative it's seeking to implement. And so the Palestinian issue can sort of be, I think, folded into, much like it was in the 60s and 70s, into, the kind of the position, the blocks of the global South and how they view the world. Because again, I mean, the position of the U.S., I mean, again, it was already discrediting itself, and then the war in Ukraine happened, and it made that much more stark for the rest of the world. And the rest of the world is looking on and saying, well, how can you push, how can you say these things in terms of Ukraine and leave Palestine completely absent? Because these things are happening contemporaneously. And now this past week has really, I mean, been much even more stark in showing the kind of complete hypocrisy, the double standard, the outright racism in which Palestinian lives are not held equal to Israeli lives, in which somebody from the EU can say sealing off Ukraine and Russia not allowing Ukraine food and water and electricity is outright terrorism. But when Israel does the exact same thing this very week to the people of Gaza, it's Israel has every right to defend itself, and this is part of its toolbox. So I think it's really exposed a lot, and I think I mean, that doesn't answer the question on Islamophobia, but I hope that's okay.
That was very helpful, Omar. Thank you. Wada, a very last question. You mentioned at the beginning the word apartheid. You lived in South Africa during Mandela's time, and how do you see, what is the path, or do you see any possibility for a solution for Israelis and for Palestinians to get rid of this apartheid condition?
To start something that could lead to a profound solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, first we need to, the Israelis need to recognize that the Palestinians are equal to them in rights, and that the Palestinians are actually the original people of the land, and that the occupation and the displacement of refugees that happened in 1948, 1967 should be resolved. These are major issues. And then after that, you can move into the way that the solution, the final solution, could be introduced. In the case of South Africa, Nelson Mandela systematically, from the and the ANC, of course, and all the forces who fought against apartheid, they maintained that we would like to have a democratic state in South Africa where everyone who is the whites and the blacks and the colors and the Indians live together in equal rights, and they could form the future of the country. Before we reach into that, there are fundamental, as I said, issues that, in my opinion, are still standing in our way, because the way that the Israelis have been seeing this and the language that have been used, not only now, but also actually from the beginning of the establishment of the state, has eliminated any possibility of looking at the Palestinians as people who have rights. And even under the heavy international pressure, in order to sign an agreement of Oslo, and before that, many other initiatives, in my opinion, there is deep conviction in the mind of the Israeli state that the Palestinians do not have the right to be equal in the way that we look at them. And it was a strategic mistake, and I have heard this many times from Israeli politicians and publicly, that it was the biggest strategic mistake that was done from 1948, that the rest of the Palestinians were not deported and exiled out of Palestine, because the ideal thing that the Israeli mind think about the situation is land without population. And that, in my opinion, systematically there, And if we do not have a real shift in that mindset, then it is useless actually to speak about South African model. We need to speak about first trying to alter that kind of psychology and to start a process where humans are equal. I mean, when I hear the Minister of Defense of Israel, the current one, speaking about the people of Gaza as animals and trying to dehumanize them in the way that he is doing, then of course you can't justify anything, including the genocide or mass displacement. And I think that is a real possibility that has been systematically in the mind of the decision makers in Israel. The issue of deporting Palestinians from West Bank into other land, especially in Iraq, and deporting Palestinians from Gaza into Sinai desert in Egypt. That was real thing. It's not just war now because of 7th of October event. I think this is somewhere in the back mind of a lot of decision makers in Israel. So we are speaking about a psychology which has gone far beyond actually the apartheid regime of South Africa. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Wadda. Thank you very much, Arlene, Omar, Daniel, and everyone who joined us in this webinar, the audience and everyone who is watching after these live broadcasts. Thank you very much, and have a very nice day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.